Before he became the most feared man in Seoul, he was a boy who fed bread to a three-legged dog and wanted to be a doctor. By the time people called him the Black Tiger, that boy was so buried beneath power and silence and carefully constructed fear that most people who worked beside him for decades never suspected he existed at all. But I knew I was there at the beginning, and I am here at the end. And what I am about to tell you is the truth that Seoul never heard, about a man everyone feared, and the wound inside him that never, not once in 60 years, stopped bleeding. I am 81 years old now. My hands shake when I pour my morning tea. My knees ache when the winter comes early, which it always does now, or perhaps I have simply become less patient with cold. I live alone in a small apartment in Nowon District, not far from the Han River, and most mornings I sit by my window and watch the water move, and I think about him, Park Sung-jin. That was his real name, the name his mother gave him, the name his father spoke aloud when he read poetry to his children on winter evenings before the tuberculosis came and took everything. The rest of Seoul knew him differently. The rest of Seoul knew him as *Hyuk Bayam, the Black Tiger. The name that made police officers look the other way, that made judges sweat through their formal robes. That moved through conversations in certain neighborhoods the way a cold draft moves through a room, felt immediately, source unknown, impossible to ignore. He controlled 17 square kilometers of the most dangerous territory in this city for nearly 4 decades. He had relationships with men at every level of official power. He was never arrested. Never charged, never in 40 years of criminal authority, placed in a room with a prosecutor who had anything sufficient to use. And every night in a quiet apartment, he kept a book of poetry on his bedside table. It had belonged to a girl he had loved when he was 18 years old. A girl whose laugh he described to me once, only once, during one long honest night, as something falling from a great height and landing softly. He never saw her again after he was 20 years old. He spent the next 50 years making sure she was safe from a distance he could never cross. This is the story of Park Sung-jin. Not the story Seoul told about him, the one nobody told. The one that deserves, finally, to be given to the world, not because it excuses what he was, but because it explains something true about what poverty does to a soul, what loss does to a heart. And what happens when a person decides at 20 years old that being vulnerable is the one thing they cannot survive. We were born in 1942, which meant we entered the world already inside a wound. The Japanese occupation was ending, but its damage still lived in the bones of Seoul. Then came the Korean War, and whatever hope remained was buried beneath hunger, grief, and smoke. By the time we were old enough to understand the world, the city already looked tired. Sung-jin grew up in Hwamdong, back when Seoul was a city of narrow alleys and coal smoke instead of glass towers and bright lights. In winter, the streets smelled of cabbage, damp stone, and burning fuel. Even the silence felt wounded. His father had once been a schoolteacher, a gentle man, serious. The kind who believed education could rescue a family from poverty. On winter nights, he read poetry aloud to his children, not for entertainment, but because he wanted them to believe beauty still existed in the world. His mother sold dried fish at Namdaemun Market. She left before sunrise and returned after dark with cracked hands and swollen feet. I never once heard her complain. They were poor in the quiet way most families were poor back then. Not dramatic poverty, just constant, like weather. Sung-jin was the oldest of 4 children. Even as a boy, he watched everything carefully. He had those dark, steady eyes that made you feel he noticed more than he said, and he rarely cried. He carried pain silently, the way some people carry old scars beneath their clothes. I met him when we were 8 years old. My family had just moved from Incheon, and on my first afternoon in the neighborhood, I found him crouched beside a small brown dog missing one of its front legs. He was tearing pieces of bread from his pocket and feeding the animal slowly, speaking to it in a calm voice. When he noticed me watching, he looked up and simply said, "She was hurt. Someone should take care of her." That was Park Sung-jin before the world changed him, before the fear, before the power, before Seoul learned to call him the Black Tiger. We became inseparable after that. We walked to school together every morning, shared meals whenever one of us had food. On summer nights, we climbed onto the roof of his building and looked out toward the Han River, talking about the men we hoped to become someday. Sungjin wanted to be a doctor. I need you to remember that. Before the violence, before the criminal empire, before men whispered his name with fear, there was simply a poor boy who wanted to heal people because he had watched his mother work herself toward exhaustion every single day. Then, in the winter of 1953, his father died of tuberculosis. Not during the war, after it. That somehow made it sadder. The disease moved through poor neighborhoods quietly, taking people one room at a time. I still remember the night it happened. Their apartment was so silent afterward it frightened me. Sungjin was 11 years old when he became the head of the family. Almost overnight, childhood disappeared from his face. He worked wherever he could, carrying deliveries, sweeping shops, cleaning machinery. He still attended school when possible, but survival came first now. And he accepted that responsibility without complaint, because complaint was a luxury poor families could not afford, but more importantly, he was watching, always watching. And what he saw in those alleys and market streets was something his father's poetry had never prepared him for. The men with kindness had empty pockets. The men with principles died tired. The men who controlled the city were not doctors or teachers or honest workers. They were men people feared. And slowly, year by year, Park Sungjin began to understand a truth that would shape the rest of his life. In Seoul, safety belonged only to the powerful. And power belonged only to men willing to become dangerous. She was 18 when he met her. She worked at a small restaurant near the Namdaemun market, the kind of place where the soup had been simmering since morning and the rice came in dented metal bowls and everything tasted like something a tired grandmother made with whatever she had left. She had a laugh. I never heard it myself, but Sungjin described it to me once, decades later, during the one night when the soju made the locked doors inside him open slightly. He said it sounded like something falling from a great height and landing softly. He said he knew that sounded like a foolish description, and he said it anyway, because it was the only honest one he had. He said she was the first person who made the future feel like a real place. Not a concept, not a distant hope, something you could walk toward and touch, a small house with light in the windows, children. Evenings that did not involve calculating what the family needed against what the week had produced. They were together for 2 years. Quietly, carefully, in the way of young people who have very little and are consequently more terrified of loss than people who have much. He brought her small things, flowers from the market. A book of poems by Kim So-wol that he found at a second-hand stall because he remembered his father and he thought she might love the beauty in them. She kept it. She kept every small thing he brought her. He told her about his father reading poetry on winter evenings. He told her about the dream of becoming a doctor, the dream he had folded away into the drawer of his impossibilities. She listened the way she always listened, completely and without offering quick solutions. When he finished, she did not tell him it was too late. She told him that dreams do not die. They change shape, but they do not die. He believed her. For 2 years, every morning he woke up believing her, and then Lee Duc-Hwan saw her. At that time, Lee Duc-Hwan was the most powerful criminal figure in southern Seoul. He controlled gambling, lending, and protection rackets across 11 neighborhoods. Politicians shook his hand in private. Police officers avoided eye contact when he entered a room. He dressed elegantly, spoke softly, and in 30 years had never been arrested for anything serious. Men like that rarely raised their voices. They never needed to. He first saw Yeonhee on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She was carrying soup across the restaurant where she worked near Namdaemun Market, moving with the quiet grace of someone completely unaware of her own beauty. Lee Duc-Hwan watched her for less than a minute before asking who she was, and then he learned she belonged to someone else, a young man named Park Sungjin. Years later, Choi Hyun-wook told me what happened next. By then he was old, sick, and finally honest enough to stop pretending certain memories did not haunt him. He said. Lee Duc-Hwan smiled. Then he said he wanted to meet the young man. In that world, it was not a request. The office stood in Yunggu inside an aging commercial building that looked ordinary from the outside. But inside, the silence felt heavy, controlled, the kind of silence powerful men create when every important decision has already been made before you arrive. Sung-jin was 20 years old when he entered that room. He was afraid, of course. But by then he already understood something important about dangerous men. Fear shown openly becomes a weapon handed directly to them. Lee Duc-Chuan studied him for a long time before speaking. "You have observant eyes," he finally said. "Eyes that remember things. I can use someone like you." Sung-jin stayed quiet. Then Lee Duc-Chuan leaned back slightly and said, almost casually, "I also hear you are close to a young woman named Oh Yeon-hee." The room became very still. Later, Sung-jin told me that in those few seconds his entire future changed. He understood the truth immediately. He had no power, no law would protect him, no honest work would protect her. No amount of love could stand against a man like Lee Duc-Chuan if that man decided he wanted something. And across the desk sat a man who had spent his entire life taking whatever he desired. Sung-jin made his decision in silence. "I would be honored to work for you directly," he said. That was all. He never mentioned Yeon-hee again. In that moment, he traded something precious for the one thing he believed could keep her safe: power, not for greed, not for glory, for protection. Because he realized with devastating clarity that the only defense against men like Lee Duc-Chuan was to become someone equally feared. He left the building at dusk and walked home alone through the streets of Seoul. I have imagined that walk many times over the years, not because something inside him broke that night. Because something inside him closed. 3 days later, Yeon-hee came to see him. She stood outside his building in the narrow alley where they had once talked about marriage and children and impossible dreams. Her eyes were red from crying. "What happened?" she asked. Sung-jin could not look at her for long. Finally he said, "It's better if we stop seeing each other." She stared at him in silence. Then she asked the question that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Do you still love me?" He answered yes to every question in his heart. But the word that came out of his mouth was, "No." That was the lie that destroyed the rest of his life. 2 years later, Yeon-hee married a hardware merchant from Jongno, an ordinary man. A decent man. Sung-jin learned these details quietly from a distance, the way lonely people sometimes watch lives they believe they no longer deserve to touch. And somehow, years later, the book of Kim So-ul poems he had once given her ended up back in his possession. I never asked how. When Sung-jin died, that book was sitting beside his bed. The only personal object in the room. For nearly 50 years, through violence, power, betrayal, and fear, he carried Yeon-hee silently inside him, like a wound that never stopped breathing. He rose through Lee Duc-Chuan's organization the way water rises, slowly, inevitably, finding every opening, filling every available space without announcing itself. I want to be very clear about something. He was not violent by nature. The violence came later, and even then it was deliberate and controlled, a tool, not a temperament. What he was, fundamentally, was intelligent, patient, and completely without illusion about the nature of the world he was inhabiting. There was a night, he told me about this years later, and it stayed with me, when he was perhaps 23, and Lee Duc-Chuan called him into the office and handed him a ledger. Not an official ledger, a second one, the real one. He said, "Tell me what you see." Sung-jin sat with that ledger for an hour. He had no formal accounting education. He had not finished school. But he read numbers the way his father had read poetry, looking for meaning beneath the surface arrangement. When he looked up, he told Lee Duc-Chuan that money was leaving through 3 separate channels that were not returning anything useful. And that 2 of the collection arrangements in Mappo were being skimmed by the men managing them. Lee Duc-Chuan looked at him for a long time, then he said, "How long have you known?" "I suspected for 3 months, Sung-jin said. "I wanted to be certain before I spoke." Lee Duc-Chuan nodded slowly. He did not ask how a 23-year-old without formal education had identified what his senior men had missed. He simply moved Sung-jin into a position of greater responsibility, the way you move a tool to the task it is best suited for. That was the moment things accelerated. By his mid-20s, Sung-jin understood not just the money but the entire geography of the Shadow City, the parallel world beneath official Seoul, where police captains and city officials and judges all had their arrangements, their understandings, their mutually maintained silences. He learned this world the way you learn a language, through immersion, not through instruction, but through constant exposure until the grammar became instinctive. And through all of it, quietly, in the part of himself he had sealed away on that evening when he walked home from Lee Duck-Hwan's office, he carried her. A laugh like something falling and landing softly, a book of poems on a second-hand stall, the specific grief of a future that had been real and then had not been. He never spoke about her. But some losses become structural. They hold up the entire building of a person, remove them, and everything collapses. It was during this period that the name appeared, Hukbaeum, the Black Tiger. I never learned who used it first, but it spread because it captured something genuinely true. A tiger does not announce itself. It does not threaten or warn or display. It simply appears, already close, already decided, already inevitable. By his early 30s, people in 17 neighborhoods of Seoul used that name with the particular quality of voice reserved for things you are careful about even in private. There was a woman during these years, her name was Bae Soo-yeon, and to leave her out would be to create a false portrait of the man. She was not Yeon-hee. She knew she was not Yeon-hee, and she had the intelligence and the honesty never to pretend otherwise. She came into his life when he was 28, through a connection I no longer remember precisely. And she assessed him with the clear eyes of someone conducting a realistic evaluation rather than constructing a romantic fantasy. What she saw was a man of genuine intelligence who had chosen a dangerous path and walked it with extraordinary control. She saw the closed quality in him, the sealed place, and she understood that it existed and that she would not be given the key to it. She chose to stay anyway, not from weakness. From a kind of pragmatic clarity about what she wanted and what was available. I had dinner with both of them once, perhaps a year after they had been together, at a small restaurant in Jongno. What I observed was this: she made him laugh, not the careful, controlled smile he used in professional situations. An actual laugh, brief and surprised, when she said something dry about a news program they had both apparently been watching. He looked for a moment, startled by his own reaction. She saw me watching and smiled at me across the table with an expression that said, clearly, yes, I know exactly what I just did and I work very hard at it. I liked her enormously. I still do, wherever she is. They had a son in 1968. His name was Jun Seo. He arrived into the world with his father's serious dark eyes and his mother's capacity for directness. And he became, immediately and completely, the one entirely unguarded place in Park Sung-jin's life. The man who revealed nothing revealed everything when that child was present. He attended every school performance. He took Jun Seo to the Han River on Sunday mornings and they walked along the path and talked, and Sung-jin's face, which was, in every professional context, still and closed as sealed stone, opened into something that I can only describe as unrecognizable. Something like peace, something like the boy in Hwamdong who had not yet understood what the city required of him. I watched this sometimes from a careful distance, navigating my own complicated position as his oldest friend, close enough to see the truth, careful enough to survive the proximity. And I thought, watching him with that child, there it is. There is what was always underneath. There is the doctor who never became one. There is the boy who fed bread to a three-legged dog because someone should take care of her. Soo-yeon left him in 1981, not dramatically. She came to him one evening with the same clear eyes she had always used to assess their arrangement, and told him she had decided she needed a different kind of life. She said it without cruelty and without excess sadness, the way one states a fact that has been known privately for some time and has simply become undeniable. He did not argue. He arranged for her financial security. He ensured that her relationship with Jun Seo continued without interference from anyone. He let her go with the same deliberate steadiness he applied to everything, but the apartment was very quiet afterward. And somewhere in Jongno, a hardware merchant's wife was raising her children and teaching school in Nowon, unknowing and unreachable. And the book of poems sat on a shelf in a quiet apartment in Seoul District, and the black tiger of Seoul sat beside it alone. Lee Duk-Hwan died in 1975. His heart stopped during dinner at a restaurant in Myeongdong. He was eating grilled eel. I have always thought that detail deserved to be recorded. Because there is something both ordinary and strange about a man who controlled the criminal world of a major city dying while eating grilled eel, as though the city forgot, briefly, that he was supposed to be terrifying. What followed was what always follows when the man at the center of a power structure disappears. Everyone who had been orbiting him began to move, some outward into open space, some inward colliding. Sungjin moved carefully. He had prepared not because he wished Lee Duk-Hwan dead, but because he understood that no arrangement outlasts the man who created it, and the prepared man is the man who survives transition. Within 2 years, he was the dominant figure in central and southern Seoul. He also had, by this point, a man he trusted. A lieutenant named Kwon Yi-bum, who had been with him for over a decade, who had proven himself in difficult situations, who laughed at Sungjin's rare jokes with what appeared to be genuine warmth. He brought Sungjin tea without being asked. He remembered small details about people in the organization, birthdays, family situations, minor preferences, and deployed them with a generosity that made the men around him feel seen. I mistrusted him. I mentioned this to Sungjin once, very carefully, the way you mention something to a powerful man that you know he does not want to hear. I said that Kwon Yi-bum's warmth felt calibrated, that he laughed at exactly the right moments and agreed at exactly the right moments, and I had never once seen him disagree with anything when other people were in the room. Sungjin listened. He thanked me. He said he would pay attention. He paid attention, and what he found confirmed everything I had said and was worse than either of us had suspected. What Kwon Yi-bum did not know was that Sungjin had, through years of careful cultivation, a relationship with a police intelligence officer named Ha Sung-ho, the kind of relationship that exists in the shadow city between men who need specific things from each other and trust each other, precisely as far as their mutual need extends. Through Ha Sung-ho, Sungjin learned that Kwon Yi-bum had been meeting with a prosecutor's investigator for 6 months. He learned within another month what they were discussing. They were building a case, and Kwon Yi-bum was laying the foundation of it, detail by careful detail, in exchange for immunity and relocation. When Sungjin was finally ready, he called Kwon Yi-bum into his office on an ordinary afternoon, and he offered him tea, and he said, very quietly, "How long have you been speaking to the prosecutor's office?" The color left Kwon Yi-bum's face completely. He looked suddenly like a much older man. He looked like someone who has been caught not just in an act but in the fundamental nature of who they are. "I am not going to hurt you," Sungjin said. He let that sit for a moment. "I want you to understand that clearly. I am not going to hurt you." He looked at Kwon Yi-bum steadily. "You chose this because you were afraid. I understand fear. I have lived inside it. What I cannot understand is that for 10 years you sat at my table and ate my food and let me believe you were something you were not." He paused. "I trusted you," he said. "I do not do that easily. I have not done it with many people in my life. What you have taken from me is not information. It is the small piece of myself I was willing to offer." Kwon Yi-bum said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I am going to remove you from my life," Sungjin continued. "Every connection between us will be severed. What you told the prosecutors will be made insufficient. And you will understand for the rest of your life that the reason you are leaving this room without consequence is not because I fear what would happen if you did not. It is because I am choosing to let you go." He was quiet for a moment. "That choice was not made for you." Kwon Yi-bum left Seoul within the week. He went to Daegu and he stayed there and he died there decades later of natural causes, and I believe he was afraid every single remaining day of his life, not of dying, of the precise measured mercy of a man he had betrayed and what it said about the depth of what he had thrown away. His son was 14 during the Kwon Yi-bum situation. Old enough to absorb the atmosphere of his father's life without being given its details. Children understand more than they are told. They learn the shape of a thing through immersion, the way they learn language, not through explanation but through constant, total exposure. Jun Seo grew up understanding that his father carried serious weight, that men showed him a specific deference, that phone calls happened behind closed doors, that the family's security had an origin nobody named. What Sungjin did not know, what he would not know until it was too late, was that Jun Seo, at 17, had formed a friendship with a boy from his school whose family was connected to an organization in Yeongdeungpo. The rival operation run by a man named Shin Boknam, who had spent a decade looking for a point of leverage against the Black Tiger and had found, in the friendship of two teenagers who shared an interest in music and chess, something he believed he could use. When Sungjin discovered this, he did what he always did. He sat with the information. He turned it over carefully, examining every angle. He waited until he understood it completely. Then he called Jun Seo into his office and he told him the truth, not every detail, but enough. He told him what his work actually was. He explained the Shadow City, what it was, how it operated, why Shin Boknam had cultivated the friendship. He told his son, for the first time, the unedited reality of who his father had become. Jun Seo was 19. He sat very still and his face moved through several expressions that I imagine were extremely painful to be the cause of. If the cause was sitting across from you and loved you completely and could do nothing to undo what he was describing. Then Jun Seo asked quietly, "Is this what you wanted for yourself?" Sungjin said nothing. "Did you have a choice?" Jun Seo said, "In the beginning." "Did you have a choice?" The silence stretched between them. It contained Hyuhamdong. It contained a father dead of tuberculosis. It contained 10 seconds in a quiet office with Lee Duk-hwan. It contained a lie told in an alley to a girl with a laugh like falling water. "No," Sungjin said finally. "I did not." "Then why?" Jun Seo said, and his voice was not angry, it was grieving. "Which was so much harder to receive than anger. Are you acting as though I should have won?" The friendship ended. Jun Seo did as his father asked, because he was his father's son and understood obligation even when it cost him something real. But something shifted between them in that office, something that had been open beginning to close, not from hatred. From the particular sorrow of a young man who has been given the full picture of the family he loves and does not know what to do with what he sees. By the mid-1980s, the Black Tiger of Seoul was at the absolute peak of his power, and he was entirely, devastatingly alone. Soo-yeon was gone. Jun Seo was in university and then abroad, sending letters and photographs of his wife and children that Sungjin kept in a desk drawer and looked at regularly and answered with letters that were warm and careful and said nothing true about his interior life. The apartment in Seoul District was large and well-furnished and silent in the particular way of spaces where one person lives with the ghost of everything that was chosen against. He walked every morning. This was new. He had never walked for its own sake before. But something in the post-Soo-yeon years required him to move, to put the city beneath his feet. To feel the ordinary rhythms of streets going about their morning business regardless of what empires were being managed from offices above them. Sometimes on those walks he passed restaurants that smelled a certain way, soup from bones simmered since morning, and something crossed his face that I saw once and never mentioned. A flash of something so old it had almost become geological. Something buried so deep it surfaced only when the exact right combination of smell and light and street angle accidentally excavated it. He visited me more often during this period than at any other time. He would arrive in the evening without calling ahead and sit in my kitchen while I made tea and talk about Hyuhamdong. About his father, about the three-legged dog which still, after 30 years, produced in him something that was almost a smile. A small, involuntary softening around the eyes. He never talked about Yeonhee directly, but she was always in the room. She was always in the room because she had never left him, not truly, not in any way that mattered. What he talked about, increasingly, was his son. Jun Seo was working abroad by then, in Germany, married, with children. The grandchildren existed as photographs in a desk drawer and a persistent, quiet ache. Sungjin was 60 years old and he had everything that the Shadow City could provide: safety, resources, influence. The total absence of any threat he could not neutralize, and he sat in my kitchen and talked about his son the way a man talks about something he is trying to figure out how to deserve. In 1990, Sungjin told me something that I have carried for 30 years. He told me without preamble on an evening when we were sitting by my window watching the street below, with our tea going cold because neither of us was paying attention to it. He simply stated it the way he sometimes stated the most important things, quietly, directly, without theatrical preparation. He said that for the past 3 years he had been funding a school in the Nowon District of Seoul, anonymously through a foundation rooted carefully enough that the source was untraceable. The school served children from the poorest families in the area. It had received money for books, meals, a new building, teachers' salaries. The principal had no idea who the benefactor was. I waited. The principal, he said, is Oh Yeon-hee. I put down my tea. After her husband died, she had returned to Seoul from Busan and taken a position at this school and eventually become its principal. She had built something genuinely remarkable there, a school known for taking in children that other schools had stopped trying with, children from damaged homes. Children who had learned to distrust institutions. She welcomed them all with the same completeness that she had once listened to a young man's buried dreams in a restaurant near Namdaemun Market. When Sungjin learned she was there, he sat with the information for weeks. He made no decision quickly. He never did. Then he began the donations. He never went there, never drove past. Never attempted to see her or write to her or send any message that could be traced back to a person rather than a foundation. He simply ensured from a distance so great it was almost purely theoretical that what she was building was supported, that the school had what it needed, that her work continued and was protected. I sat very still and thought about everything I understood about this man. He had spent 50 years operating from a position of power. He had never once used that power to put himself in the same room as the woman he had never stopped loving. The school was his one act of love that he allowed himself. Given from a distance he could not cross, given without acknowledgement or gratitude or any form of return. Given because he understood that standing close to her would be the one thing in his life that his considerable control could not manage. She was the open wound. The one he had kept open deliberately, I think, because it was the last true thing, the last place where the boy from Hyeomdong still lived. I do not know what to call what he did. It was not noble exactly, it was not simple. It was the imperfect, painful thing that people do when they love someone and understand that the love cannot be given directly, and so they give it sideways, quietly. At an angle the beloved will never see. She never knew, I hope in some way that cannot be explained, that she felt it anyway. In 1998, Jun Seo came back to Seoul for the first time in 3 years. He sat with his father in the apartment in Seoul District and they ate together and talked about safe things, politics, his work, his children, and then, during a pause that had settled into something more honest than the rest of the conversation, Jun Seo said, "Abioji, you should stop." Sungjin looked at him. "Whatever you are still doing, you should stop." Jun Seo's voice was even and careful. "I am not asking because I am ashamed of you. I am not asking because of what other people think. I am asking because you are 60 years old and you look like a man who has been carrying the entire city on his back for 40 years, and I think it is killing you slowly." He paused. "And I think you have the right to put it down." That sentence, Sungjin told me about it later. He said it had been like hearing a door handle turn after decades of believing the door was sealed from the outside. The idea that release could be chosen rather than defeated, that walking away was not failure but something closer to wisdom. Something closer to the freedom he had given away in Lee Duc-Chuan's office at 20 years old. This idea arrived in him through his son's voice and moved something very deep. He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "You are more like your grandfather than you know." Jun Seo had never known his grandfather. He knew only the basics: a schoolteacher, a reader of poetry, a man who died too young. Sungjin told him that evening about the poetry. About a boy in Hyeomdong on winter evenings, listening to his father's voice shape the words of Kim Soal about rivers and seasons and the passage of things. And Jun-seo listened the way Yeon-hee had once listened, completely, without interruption, present for every word. It was the most honest conversation Sungjin had had since the night he told his son the truth about the Shadow City, perhaps the most honest one of his life. He began after that visit to prepare for the ending. It took 3 years. The careful transition of an organization built over 4 decades cannot be done quickly without creating the kind of chaos that hurts people. And Sungjin had spent too long protecting the people inside his structure to abandon them carelessly at the end. He distributed authority rather than concentrating it in a single successor, because he had learned from watching Lee Duc-hwan that concentration of power was its own form of fragility. He maintained certain arrangements through their natural conclusions and let others dissolve quietly. By 2001, he was effectively retired. He moved to a smaller apartment. Mafia district near the river, not far from where I sit writing this now. He walked every morning, longer walks than before. He cooked his own meals, which he had not done for 30 years because there had always been people to do it, and he found, with something close to surprise, that he genuinely enjoyed it. The attention required, the immediate, tangible result, soup from bones simmered since morning. He called Jun-seo more often. The conversations were better. Not entirely easy, the old sediment of what had not been said was still there, would always be there, but warmer, more genuine. Less like two people being careful and more like a father and son who had both decided that the time remaining was more important than the history between them. He read. He had never had time for reading during the years of power. Now he had nothing but time, and he used it the way he had once used ledgers, looking for meaning beneath the surface, for the grammar underneath the language. He bought a new edition of Kim Soal's collected poems. I noticed it on my first visit to the Mappo apartment, sitting on his bookshelf beside the old, worn copy, the one that had lived beside his bed for 50 years. I looked at both books and I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the image did not already say more clearly. In 2003, Sungjin suffered a stroke. It was not fatal, but it weakened his right hand and slowed the steady confidence with which he had once moved through every room in Seoul. For the first time in his life, he looked fragile. Jun-seo flew from Germany with his wife and children, including a 6-year-old granddaughter who had inherited her father's serious eyes and none of the politeness adults use to hide uncomfortable truths. They stayed for a month. Later, Sungjin told me it was the happiest month of his life. He said it almost with embarrassment, like a man who had spent decades chasing power only to discover that happiness had been sitting quietly inside ordinary moments all along. On the 3rd afternoon of their visit, his granddaughter climbed into the chair beside him while he was reading. She studied his face carefully for several seconds before saying, "Haraboji, you look sad." Sungjin smiled faintly. "You're right," he said. "I've been sad for a very long time. Children never stop where adults would." "Why?" For a moment he did not answer. I sometimes imagine everything that must have passed through his mind in that silence. A 3-legged dog in a cold alley, his father reading poetry during winter nights. A frightened 20-year-old sitting across from Lee Duc-hwan, Yeon-hee laughing in a restaurant near Namdaemun Market. A lie spoken in an alley that had followed him for 60 years. Finally he said, "When I was young, I made choices I thought I had to make, and when you grow old, you spend a lot of time wondering if you were right." His granddaughter considered this seriously. Then, without another word, she climbed into his lap, rested her head against his chest, and returned to her book as though sadness were something simple people should not carry alone. His weakened hand rested gently against her back, and for the first time in 60 years I saw something in Park Sungjin soften completely, not disappear, not heal, but loosen its grip. He lived another 6 years. The second stroke came in February of 2009, smaller than the first but final in its own quiet way. After that, his body began slowly letting go of the world. Jun Seo returned to Seoul and stayed beside him through the final weeks. And during those nights, father and son finally spoke honestly, not as a feared crime boss and the son burdened by his legacy. Just as two aging men trying to make peace before time ran out, Sungjin told him stories about Hwamdong, about his father reading poetry on winter evenings, about poverty, survival, and the kind of loneliness men carry without speaking about it. But he never mentioned Yeonhee. Some loves remain private even at the edge of death. On his final night, Jun Seo picked up the old Kim Soal poetry book from the bedside table, the worn copy Sungjin had kept beside him for decades, and began reading aloud. The poem was about winter ending, about ice loosening on a river, about things held tightly for too long finally learning how to let go. Sungjin listened with his eyes closed. By morning, he was gone. Afterward, they found an old photograph beside the book. A young woman standing at a market stall, smiling at something outside the frame. The corner of the photograph was worn with age, but her face still carried that rare kind of aliveness certain old photographs refused to lose. No one in the room recognized her. I did. But I said nothing. Some names belong to the dead. Sometimes I still think about her living quietly in Busan, never knowing that for 20 years a man she once loved had protected her school from a distance he could never cross. I hope the school is still standing, I hope children still fill its halls, and I hope somehow that a part of Park Sungjin still lives there too, not the Black Tiger. Just the boy who once wanted to heal people instead of frightening them. I am 81 years old and I have sat with this story long enough to know that nothing is as simple as it appears from outside. Park Sungjin was not a good man by the measures that matter most. He operated through coercion and fear. He accumulated power through means that no court would excuse and no reasonable person would defend. There were people who were hurt by what he built and what he maintained, and that is true regardless of what else is also true, and it deserves to be said plainly. And he was also a boy in a post-war alley feeding bread to a three-legged dog because someone should take care of her. He was a 20-year-old who chose silence in Lee Duck-Hwan's office because he understood with devastating clarity that rage was the only weapon he had that guaranteed he lost everything. He was a man who funded a school for 20 years from a distance he never crossed because he understood that standing close to the woman he loved was the one thing his considerable control could not survive. I sit by my window in Mafia District and I watch the Han River move through the city. I think about what water carries. All the things placed into it over the years, all the grief and the history and the discarded things. Water does not destroy what it carries. It moves it, changes its location, changes its shape. But the thing itself persists, flowing out towards somewhere new. That is what I believe about Park Sungjin. I believe the boy who wanted to be a doctor was always there. Behind the stillness and the power and the armored decades, behind the Black Tiger, behind Hwamdong, behind every closed door and sealed room. That boy was always there, carrying his wanting the way water carries things, changed in form, changed in location, but never destroyed. The choices we make when we are young and desperate and powerless form a current that we spend our lives swimming inside. Some of us find our way to calmer water, some do not. He almost did. And in those final weeks, with his son reading poetry beside him and a granddaughter's weight still warm in the memory of his weakened hand, perhaps he found something close enough to peace that the distinction stopped mattering. I choose to believe he did, because that is the only mercy left to offer a man who spent his whole life providing it to everyone except himself. For the ones who feared him, for the ones who loved him, for the woman in the photograph whose name nobody said aloud, and for everyone who has ever made an irreversible choice and lived inside it for 60 years. Wondering at the end if the person they might have been is still somewhere, waiting. They are, I promise you, they are always waiting. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoy this story, stay connected to us.